Hi, everyone. This is our Merleau Ponty reading group. We are continuing our reading of The Structure of Behavior from page 124 of the English translation. So we are on the conclusion of the first part or chapter, whatever it's called. Let me just check. Chapter, I think. Oh, sorry, the second one, because we skipped the first one. Yes, so we are on the conclusion of chapter 2, Higher Forms of Behavior. Right. So last time we looked at what he calls symbolic forms. So he had given us this hierarchy of forms of behavior in different animals. So all animals or most animals will exhibit each of these forms of behavior, but to different degrees or in different situations. So the first one is the immovable forms. His example of this was the toad that tries to catch the earthworm, even though there's a piece of glass in between the toad and the worm. The toad will just keep trying to catch it over and over again, just sort of repeating this behavior no matter how many times it fails. So this is an immovable behavior. It's sort of there's like a direct link between the perceived object, the earthworm, and the behavior that it triggers in the toad that perceived it. This is sort of the least flexible kind of behavior and at most kind of automatic behavior. The next level of this hierarchy was the syncretic forms. So these were the forms of behavior that involve this kind of flexible and dynamic adaptation to the perceived object. So he went through many different examples from like experimental results in different animals. But this is like maybe the most familiar kind of behavior in, say, domestic animals. The way that your dog, for example, interacts with you and sort of recognizes the different, the different forms of your behavior. Your dog can often sort of determine whether you're in a good mood or you're angry or whatever, based on very subtle cues about like your voice, your movements, and so on, things that you might not even recognize yourself. The dog is sensitive to these very subtle signals and can respond in an appropriate way. I think a couple weeks ago, I talked about this famous case from the early 20th century of Ed the horse, who was this sort of show animal that was brought around to like different fairs, I think in the US, or no, I think it was, I can't remember where it was anyway. So sort of shown as this animal that was capable of performing arithmetic. So like you would give someone in the audience would say like, ask Ed the horse what is 27 plus 32 or whatever. And then the horse would stamp its hoof a certain number of times to give the answer. And it was eventually determined that of course the horse was not actually performing arithmetic, but what it was doing was watching the owner or the trainer, and the trainer was sort of watching how many times the horse tapped its hoof, and once it reached the correct number, there would be a change of some kind in like facial expression or posture or whatever that the horse would recognize, and then stop at the right number. And so if you ask the horse or the trainer horse team a question that the trainer didn't know the answer to, the horse would not be able to respond. As far as I know, like based on the discussions I've seen of it, it wasn't the case that the trainer was sort of deliberately setting up a trick or a con operation or something. It was just these sort of cues that the trainer was giving without even being aware of it that the horse was responding to. So again, that's this very subtle sort of adaptive and dynamic response to information coming from the perceived environment that even humans studying a situation might not be able to observe. It might take like detailed studies of controlling all the different factors to figure out what exactly it is that the animal is responding to. So it's and these types of behavior can also bring about like these pretty complicated and impressive feats that certain animals are capable of. You can think of birds that navigate, that migrate from like the Arctic to the tropics. So they're crossing thousands of kilometers, and they return to like the same breeding ground every year. So they're returning to one precise location over the course of thousands of kilometers. So if they like at their starting point, if they had deviated by a degree, a fraction of a degree in the angle of their path, they would end up in a completely different location. So they're capable of navigating very precisely over long distances. But I think like some of these sort of navigation feats are not like I think fully understood. But in certain birds, they seem to be responding to the Earth's magnetic field as part of their navigating skill. And other birds, I mentioned pigeons, have this infrasound perception, so they can hear the way that the wind flow or the airflow interacts with objects in the landscape, like mountains and so on. And so they're essentially hearing the landscape as they fly over it, and so they can respond to the sound as they're flying. So they know like when I hear this sort of pattern of sound, then I turn so many degrees left or navigate in this direction. So yeah, it's a very sophisticated navigation skill that it's far better than most humans would be able to do without instruments. But at the same time, it's always linked to this kind of adaptation to their current perceptual environment. There's like an engagement with the perception, the input of information that they're receiving from their environment at every moment of this behavior. And so the last stage after so we have the amovable forms and then the syncretic forms, and then the last one is the symbolic forms. And so here I think maybe one sort of good way of explaining this contrast between syncretic and symbolic forms is like when you compare this pigeon navigation that I just talked about with human navigation, or the way that most of us today would navigate. You would use either a paper map or a map on your phone. And this map is a symbolic depiction of the territory you're trying to navigate. So it has lines that indicate roads. It has maybe a blue stretch that indicates water, etc. And so you have this representation at a much smaller scale of the territory you want to move around in, and you have to, as like part of the sort of cognitive accomplishment of using this map to navigate, is you have to understand the relationship between the representation and the object represented, the landscape made up of roads and rivers and so on. And so you have to sort of be able to find the correspondence between this point on the map and this point in the world, and move between them move around the world in relation to the representation on the map. So this is quite different compared to like than the way the pigeon is navigating, because the pigeon doesn't have like a little map in its head. It doesn't sort of represent an image of the landscape in the same way as a map on your phone does. It's just responding to all the different cues, the magnetic field and the sounds and so on. So yeah, this is sort of like an example of this contrast between a symbolic sort of representational way of navigating the world and responding to the environment versus this dynamic engagement with perceptual information coming in at each step of the behavioral process. And so this sort of symbolic form, what Merleau-Ponty argues is sort of characteristic of it is this notion of a shared structure. Like in the case of the map, like if you look at it depends on what type of map it is, but it will, for example, there'll be a correspondence of distances on the map with distances in the world. So like you have a certain scale of a map, 1,000 to 1 or whatever. So if you have a distance of 1 centimeter on the map, it will be, I don't know, 1 kilometer in the world, or whatever the scale is. There'll be some sort of correspondence between distances on the map and distances in the world. Other types of maps preserve angles instead of distances, so that like if you draw a line from point A to point B and you measure the angle with a line of latitude or longitude, then if you start at the point represented by point A on the map, like whatever city or port or whatever, and then you move in the angle that you find on the map to the other point, then you will reach the point B in the real world as well. Anyway, there's different sort of projections of a spherical globe onto a plane surface, and they preserve different properties and are used for different purposes. But in any case, there's some sort of correspondence between some property of the representation in the map and the property of the object represented in the world. Otherwise, if there wasn't some sort of correspondence, some sort of property that's preserved or shared between the representation and the object represented, then it wouldn't really be a representation at all. It wouldn't have any use. Like if every point of the map, was sort of randomly assigned to a point on the globe, it would not really be a very useful map. So yeah, this sort of correspondence of structure is what Merleau-Ponty points to as being the characteristic property of this symbolic form of behavior. And another example that he gives here is the relationship between notes on a keyboard, on a piano or whatever, and the layout of keys. So in a certain sense, it's arbitrary. There's no reason, sort of intrinsic reason, why you would put the high notes on the right side of the keyboard and the low notes on the left, as opposed to the opposite. But once you choose one direction or the other, then it's not arbitrary that, for example, one note is between two other notes on the keyboard in the physical layout and space, if that note is between those two notes in the pitch sequence. So like once you select a direction, then the intervals and where the notes fall on the physical layout has to correspond with the way that the notes are laid out in the pitch, in the order of pitches. So there's a correspondence in structure between the tones as auditory sensations or auditory properties, and then the layout of keys on the keyboard in physical space. So yeah, there's this sort of shared structure where there's correspondence between the structure of the pitches and the structure of the keys on the keyboard. And so yeah, so what you sort of learn as a musician, as someone who's capable of playing the piano or using a keyboard instrument, is not just a sort of physical sequence of movements. It's instead you sort of master this correspondence, and this is demonstrated, or Merleau-Ponty argues that this is demonstrated by the fact that being capable of playing the piano doesn't just mean doesn't just mean memorizing a set of movements and performing a piece that you memorized, but it also gives you the capacity to improvise. Or like, for example, if you can play a certain piece in one key, you can transpose it, and it takes a certain amount of skill, but transpose it to a different key and play the same piece in a different key. So you're using different movements to perform the same structure of intervals and chords and so on. So yeah, this capacity for improvisation is sort of what demonstrates the mastery of the representation or the symbolic nature of this correspondence between two structures. And he also mentions the case of language, and this is something we discussed in relation to Chomsky before. The fact that as a speaker of your native language or any other language that you master, you are capable of producing and understanding essentially an infinite number of sentences that have never been produced before. You can like if you could only understand sentences that you had previously heard, then we would not say that you actually understand the language. You've just sort of memorized a set of sentences, a set of sounds, and then said this set of sounds requires this particular response or something like that. It's not really learning the language. We only say someone has mastered the language if they are in fact capable of producing new sentences and understanding new sentences. So that there's a certain improvisation that is intrinsic to what we mean by grasping a language or mastering a language. So yeah, this capacity for improvisation, this capacity for novelty is sort of an intrinsic aspect of what it means to have this symbolic form of behavior, this capacity to grasp the structure of a symbolic representation of some domain. Right, so I think that's mostly what we looked at last time. So we can, let me just get to the right page. Yeah, so we can jump to the conclusion on page 124, if someone would like to pick up from there.
I can read. Conclusion. Preceding chapters teach us not only to explain the higher by the lower, but also not to the lower by the higher. Traditionally, lower are mechanical relations which, like physical events, are functions of antecedent conditions, and thus unfold in objective time and space, are distinguished from quote-unquote higher reactions, which do not depend on stimuli taken materially, but rather on the meaning of the situation, and which appear therefore to presuppose a quote-unquote view of this situation, prospection, and to belong no longer to the order of the in itself, en soi, but to the order of the for itself, pour soi. Both of these orders are transparent to the mind. The first is transparent for the mode of thinking in physics and is like the external order in which events govern each other from the outside. The second is transparent for reflective consciousness and is like the internal order in which that which takes place always depends upon an intention. Behavior, inasmuch as it has a structure, is not situated in either of these two orders. It does not unfold in objective time and space like a series of physical events. Each moment does not occupy one point of time. Rather, at the decisive moment of learning, a quote-unquote now stands out from the series of quote-unquote nows, acquires a particular value, and summarizes the groupings which have preceded it as it engages and anticipates the future of the behavior. This quote-unquote now transforms the singular situation of the experience into a typical situation, and the effective reaction into an aptitude. From this moment on, behavior is detached from the order of the in itself, en soi, and becomes the projection outside the organism, possibility which is internal to it. The world, inasmuch as it harbors living beings, ceases to be a material plenum consisting of juxtaposed parts. It opens up at the place where behavior appears. Nothing would be served by saying that it is we, the spectators, who mentally unite the elements of the situation to which behavior is addressed in order to make them meaningful, that it is we who project into the interior the intentions of our thinking, since we would still have to discover what it is, what kind of phenomenon is involved, upon which this Einfühlung rests. What is the sign which invites us to anthropomorphism? Nor would anything be served by saying that behavior, quote, is conscious, unquote, and that it reveals to us as its other side, a being for itself, hidden behind the visible body. The gestures of behavior, the intentions which it traces in the space around the animal, are not directed to the true world of pure being, but to being for the animal, that is, to a certain milieu characteristic of the species. They do not allow the showing through of a consciousness, that is, a being whose whole essence is to know, but rather a certain manner of treating the world, of, quote, being in the world, unquote, or of, quote, unquote, existing. A consciousness, according to Hegel's expression, is a, quote, penetration in being, unquote. And here we have nothing yet but an opening up. The chimpanzee, which physically can stand upright, but in all urgent cases reassumes the animal posture, which can assemble boxes but gives them only a tactile equilibrium, in this way manifests a sort of adherence to the here and now, a short and heavy manner of existing. Gelb and Goldstein's patient, who no longer has the quote-unquote intuition of numbers, no longer quote-unquote understands analogies, and no longer quote-unquote perceives simultaneous wholes, betrays a weakness, a lack of density and vital amplitude, of which the cognitive disorders are only the secondary expression. It is only at the level of symbolic conduct, and more exactly at the level of exchanged speech, that foreign existences, at the same time as our own, moreover, appear to us as ordered to the true world. It is only at this level that, instead of seeking to insinuate his stubborn norms, the subject of behavior, quote, derealizes himself, quote, and becomes a genuine alter ego. And yet the constitution of the other person as another I is never completed, since his utterance, even having become a pure phenomenon of expression, always and indivisibly remains expressive as much of himself as of the truth. Yes, a lot in these two paragraphs. But this seems to, take up again this distinction that he makes in the introduction to the book between mechanism and intellectualism, both of which he's rejecting. It's the idea of a pure transparency of objective space and time, but at the same time, a self-transparent for itself, which is somehow independent of the world in which it finds itself. And this point about learning, I thought was interesting, that learning, there's something about learning that can't be described on just a kind of neutral and objective timeline. At the moment something is learned, the series of nows itself changes, and a new mode of comportment to the world becomes available for the organism. Actually, I think might be a good way to think about what Deleuze says about singular points and ordinary points in difference in repetition and logic of sense, especially as we were talking about before the recording, given his emphasis on learning. I think this fits well.
Yeah, I think like what we can think about is he mentioned, I think it was last week, the reading we did last week, or maybe the week before, this notion or this problem of like, what is the relationship between something that you don't understand and then your grasp of it once you do understand it? Like you have a problem, like a homework assignment, it could be, or a problem you're trying to solve in your work life. How do I fix this engine or whatever it is? You don't really understand it. Things don't make sense, and then at some point you go, oh yeah, now I get it. Now I know what to do. Clearly, there's some relationship between the problem as you understood it or experienced it before you grasped it, and then the solution. There has to be some connection that makes it so the solution of this problem and not some other problem. But sort of explaining what that connection is, it turns out to be quite difficult because like if the solution was already there in the problem, then you can't really understand how it was impossible for you to see that in the first place. If the solution was already part of the sort of structure of the situation that made up the problem, then you should just be able to look at that structure of the problem and say, okay, here's the solution. But when you're dealing with like a sort of genuine problem, a difficult problem that requires thinking and experimentation and trial and error to solve, then it's precisely not the case of just examining the problem and then being able to sort of read off the solution. It requires creativity and sort of problem solving skills to find the solution. So clearly the relationship is more obscure and difficult than just sort of being like contained in the problem at the outset. And it's the same thing like learning. You can think of learning as a kind of problem solving, or problem solving as a kind of learning, whichever direction you want to use. But like when you're say a student, you're trying to grasp some procedure, I don't know, like how to solve a certain kind of equation or something. You are doing things that don't really make any sense. The teacher just tells you do this, and this is how you do it, and you don't know why. But then at some point you sort of figure it out. You grasp what it is, and then at that point, yeah, you just sort of understand. You know how to use this procedure. You understand why you're doing it. You know how to use it in new situations that you haven't seen before. And yeah, as Bats put in the chat here, so sometimes even once you have that moment of sort of grasping the solution or understanding why this procedure works, then it's hard to even understand why you didn't understand it before, or like why it was so difficult. It just seems obvious at that point. And this is part of what makes teaching so hard, that if you already understand something and your student or whoever it is you're teaching doesn't understand it, sometimes it's hard to grasp like how they could even not understand it because it just seems obvious to you. And so like part of the skill of teaching is to sort of suspend your understanding of something and sort of put yourself back in the position of not understanding it yet, and sort of being able to find a way of leading the person, the student or the person learning, lead them towards that understanding from a position of not understanding. So it requires a certain, I don't know, mental flexibility of like being able to shift between the viewpoint of someone who doesn't yet understand something and someone who does already understand it, and then like find a path between those 2 points that the student can follow. And yeah, not everyone is really capable of doing this in a sort of skilled way, and that's what makes it so valuable when you do have someone who's a skilled teacher who is able to help students in that way. So yeah, this learning moment, or this point where suddenly things make sense, or suddenly the solution becomes apparent. It's not just sort of one moment in a sequence of moments. It sort of restructures the whole sequence so that the previous set of trials suddenly become part of the process through which you learned to grasp the situation, whereas before they just seemed like sort of a sequence of failures. It didn't really make any sense. And then once you grasp the solution, you can see, okay, this is why what I did before didn't work, or why it was not quite what I needed. So yeah, this moment of grasping the solution or understanding the problem sort of retroactively gives sense to all the previous attempts that before just seemed like meaningless failures. And then the next bit he talks about like potential objection you could give to this kind of characterization of learning. Yeah. So this description of learning would apply not just to humans but to other animals. That the chimpanzee that suddenly figures out, oh, I can use this stick to grasp the banana that's outside my cage that I can't reach. This is the same type of process as a person who is learning how to solve a type of equation. Obviously there's a lot of differences as well, but this sort of restructuring of the learning situation is the same type of phenomenon in both cases. But the objection would be that this is a kind of anthropomorphization or projection onto the animal of our own experience. So it's just us as the observer who sort of grasp the situation as this kind of understanding that we see the chimpanzee, and then we sort of project our own experience of solving a problem onto the chimpanzee's process of grasping the stick and using it to reach the bananas. And so what Merleau-Ponty argues here in response to that is essentially that for one thing, this doesn't account for why it's possible to project this understanding in some cases but not others. So when you're studying a chimpanzee's behavior, it does make sense to describe what the chimpanzee is doing as suddenly realizing or suddenly understanding the spatial relationships of the stick and the banana, and the possibility of reaching the banana with the stick. If you use this language of description of understanding, of grasping a situation, then it's appropriate to the situation. It sort of makes sense of the situation. But if you are describing, I don't know, a thermostat and how it responds to the temperature, and you say, oh, the thermostat sort of grasped the temperature was too low and solved the problem by turning on the furnace, it doesn't really do any work that helps you understand the way that the thermostat is responding to the environment. It's not sort of a useful description of what the thermostat is doing. So yeah, there are certain cases where it is useful and helps you understand the situation, and other cases where it isn't. And this is not just sort of an arbitrary fact of our decision to apply the language of understanding in one case and not the other. So there's something about the chimpanzee as opposed to the thermostat that makes the language of understanding appropriate in one case and not in the other. So talking about this sort of projection onto the chimpanzee sort of doesn't account for what it is about the chimpanzee that makes it appropriate to even project that language onto the chimpanzee in the first place. And that's what Merleau-Ponty is trying to grasp. What is it about a chimpanzee that makes it the case that it's useful and appropriate to describe the chimpanzee as understanding the spatial situation, whereas it is not useful or appropriate to describe the thermostat as understanding the temperature. So what like sort of the presupposition of this like projection objection is that the sort of real world, the world that truly exists, is one that is sort of made up of just spatial parts next to each other that has no sort of meaning to it in any intrinsic sense, and then it's only the subject, whether it's a human, potentially chimpanzee, depending on what you how you interpret the chimpanzee's behavior. But some subject is sort of projecting meaning onto the world, and it's sort of intrinsically distinct from the world, and then sort of adds meaning to it, and when it grasps a situation as involving the capacity to reach bananas, it's sort of projecting this meaning onto a set of spatial arrangements of matter that is intrinsically meaningless. So this sort of picture is already presupposed by this notion that the human observer looking at the chimpanzee is projecting the meaning onto the situation. But what the sort of alternative way of looking at the world that Merleau-Ponty wants to derive from the situation is that it's this sort of grasp of a meaningful world that is actually primary, and this description of the world in physical terms as spatially extended matter, for example, is secondary, is derived from this grasp of the world in terms of understanding, and so we and this is actually a sophisticated intellectual achievement, is to grasp the world in these physical terms. It involves this symbolic cognition of measuring objects in terms of spatial extension of weight and so on. And so all this is sort of built into the description of the world in terms of physical properties. And this is not sort of the original insertion into the world or relationship with the world. And so, he wants us to sort of reverse our direction of perspective, instead of starting from this physical world and then trying to figure out how this meaning is projected onto it. We start from this world as grasped in understanding, and then see how the physical world is sort of built on that foundation.
I thought this reference to intersubjectivity and symbolic content, or symbolic conduct at the end of this second paragraph was interesting too. That you need at the same time as you have symbolic conduct, you have the ability to have some kind of grasp of the perspective of another, and also of yourself, as the ability to think of yourself from this kind of third person perspective as well. And the point at the end about the constitution of the other person as another I never being complete. It seems like maybe the point is that even though the other symbolically express herself, there's something which is never, never grasped in that expression from an external standpoint, because of this fact that he says it remains expressive of the speaker, as much of the speaker truth. So there's something in the expression that kind of doesn't get conveyed. Almost sounds Lacanian.
Yeah, the relationship between Merleau-Ponty and psychoanalysis is there's I think some literature on that I don't really know that much about. There is a chapter on psychoanalysis in Phenomenology of Perception, so I think this relationship to intersubjectivity. So, what is the relationship between symbolic conduct or the symbolic form of behavior and intersubjectivity? So, I think the way I would try to explain this is going back to what I was talking about in relation to last week I talked about the capacity that a lion has to perceive an antelope trying to hide in the grass. So sometimes the lion succeeds in perceiving the antelope. Sometimes the antelope succeeds in hiding. And from a certain perspective, we might say that in the case where the antelope succeeds in hiding, the lion has failed to perceive the antelope. It would be better for the lion if it had better visual acuity, better eyes, or better processing in the visual cortex, or if it was motivated to search the grass more intensively or whatever. But from a sort of bigger picture perspective, or more like, I guess, organism level perspective, all of these sort of better visual perception features would have a cost associated with them. It takes more metabolic energy to develop more a better eye, or more visual cortex to process what's coming into your eyes, or if the lion spends more time looking at the grass trying to find antelopes, that means it has less time to do other things. So each of these things has a cost, and from a sort of evolutionary perspective, there's a trade-off for the lion in terms of being better at finding antelopes, but maybe being worse at finding potential mates, or avoiding rivals, or whatever other things lions need to do in their lives to survive and reproduce. So there's you can't just sort of isolate one factor of perception of that the lion engages in, and then say this is not good enough, or it should be better, or something. You have to look at the whole sort of mode of existence of a lion in the world as a kind of balancing of all these evolutionary pressures that all sort of form the way that the lion is constituted, its anatomy and physiology, and then its behavior, the way it behaves in the world. All of this is just sort of what makes up a lion, and there's no sort of sense in which you can say it's not good enough, or not adequate, or something like that. It just, the lion is just being a lion, and that's what it is. And there's no, and we can also sort of describe this as saying there's no real sort of engagement with truth on the lion's part. It's not that it sort of misperceives the antelope. It's just that antelope perception is only one element of the mode of existence of a lion, that the lion devotes a certain amount of metabolic resources, a certain amount of time, etc., towards, and no more, because that's just what constitutes being a lion. And the fact that it only recognizes antelope 50% of the time, or 80% of the time, or whatever, as opposed to 100, is just part of the nature of a lion-antelope relationship. And you can't sort of criticize the lion for missing the antelope the remaining 20% of the time. Whereas in the case of humans who are perceiving, say, observing the antelope in the grass, you can say that there is an engagement with truth. There is a sort of norm of being able to perceive the antelope, and a certain failure if you miss the antelope. You can sort of hold a human up to a standard of grasping the truth of a situation in a way that is not the case with the lion responding to its environment. And so this is connected with intersubjectivity in the sense that we hold each other to the truth of a situation. We don't just say, this person, engaged in human behavior in relation to the antelope, and didn't observe the antelope hidden in the grass, and that's just part of what it is to be a human. We say that you failed to perceive the antelope, you made a mistake, or you were not observant enough, or whatever. You didn't grasp the truth of the situation, that there was an antelope hidden in the grass. And so when the person, say, looks in the grass and then comes back and says, no, there's no antelope there, and then later on you find there was an antelope, you say, okay, you made a mistake, or you were not observant enough. You sort of hold the person to the standard of truth in a way that the lion is not held to the standard of truth. And so, yeah, there's this sort of correlation, or sort of co-emergence, I guess, of this truth at the level of symbolic cognition, this relationship to what the way the world is, as opposed to just this sort of behavioral adaptation to the world on the one hand, and then this capacity to share a propositional content for one person to tell the other person the way the world is, and then for the second person to hold the other person to the standard of truth, and to say, no, you made a mistake, or you didn't tell the truth. So I think truth. Yeah. So the question is, is truth linguistic in this sense? We hold others to truth because we can make judgment. I think for Merleau-Ponty, he would say it's not so much linguistic as symbolic. So a map, for example, can be true or false. It can represent the relationship between two cities, or the river and the mountain, or whatever, correctly or incorrectly. Given a certain projection function, or what the map is supposed to depict, it can either correctly or incorrectly perform that depiction. And so we can say this is a good map or a bad map in terms of whether it is correct in depicting the relationships and properties of the object of the landscape it's supposed to depict. And so that's not necessarily linguistic. It's using using visual properties of marks on paper or on a phone screen or whatever to depict properties of the world. So Angus would put here there's something normative about symbolic life. I think that's right. It has this intrinsic capacity to be evaluated in a way that the syncretic forms of behavior that the lion is exhibiting in relation to the antelope are not normative. They're sort of not. It's not really possible to evaluate the lion as either being good or bad, or correct or incorrect. A lion just does lionness. It just lives a lion life, and that is just what a lion lions. That would be the Heideggerian way of putting it. And there's no sort of measure or standard. You could say that being a lion is good or bad. It just is what it is. It just a lion just sort of persists in being, to use the Spinozistic phrase. It just tries to take advantage of opportunities in its environment, avoid dangers and obstacles, and ensure that it continues to exist and that it reproduces, and that the lion lineage continues to exist. It just does that, and it's either successful at doing that or not successful. But there's no sort of evaluation of whether it's good to be a lion, whether the lion lineage should exist or continue to exist. As opposed to in human life, we can think about, is it good to live in this way? Is this something that deserves to continue to exist or not? We can, sort of at a high level, we can also evaluate individual expressions of behavior. We can say that, this action is appropriate or inappropriate to a situation, or this statement is true or false, and so on. So I think this is characteristic of symbolic behavior in general, is this capacity to be subject to evaluation in a way that the syncretic forms of behavior exhibited by other animals are not subject to evaluation. Yeah, I think that's right. So yeah, Angus would put here there's something about the introduction of the symbolic third term, which brings with it the possibility of being wrong. So wrong in the general sense of being sort of inappropriate or not evaluated negatively, I guess. So not just wrong in the sense of incorrect, but also morally wrong sometimes, or inappropriate to the situation, or an incorrect solution to a problem, etc. There are various ways something can be wrong, and it's only if there is. So you can only describe something as a symbolic representation insofar as it's possible to misrepresent whatever is being represented. So like the keyboard example, the sequence of notes, if you started playing the keys, playing a scale, and then the third note was the wrong note. The third key played a different note than the one that should be in that place. It was lower instead of higher, for example. You would say this keyboard has the wrong representation of the scale. So this the representational or symbolic relationship between the sequence of notes, the sequence of tones, and the sequence of keys on the keyboard is representational insofar as you could lay out the keys in the wrong order. You could it would be possible to not have a representational relationship between those two structures. So if there were no sort of space of potential error or potential misrepresentation, then it wouldn't be a representational relationship at all. Yeah, Batts has sort of made an allusion here to the Aristotelian account of living beings in terms of teleology. Um, yeah, and whether that, so the question is whether this teleological account sort of influences our tendency to evaluate other beings as being successful or not, in the sense that it sort of gives them a purpose or endows them with a purpose. Yeah, and so there's a whole sort of question in philosophy of biology about like to what extent are evolutionary explanations and teleology compatible with each other, whether and to what extent and how those two things are compatible with each other. And so like if you look at a biology textbook, physiology textbook or whatever, you'll see like all kinds of things described in terms of function. The function of the heart is to circulate blood throughout the body. The function of the lungs is to absorb oxygen from the air and expel carbon dioxide, etc. Every organ and cell and so on has a function, and of course functions are understood, at least in the first instance, as teleological. A heart is for pumping blood, and if it doesn't pump blood or doesn't pump it in the way that we describe as the normal or proper way of pumping blood, then we say that the heart has a disorder or dysfunction or disease or whatever. So we're evaluating the heart insofar like based on a measure of what it's supposed to do. We say the heart is either doing or not doing what it's supposed to do, and so we're using a normative standard to evaluate the heart. But then, in some respect, we also treat this, or anyway, this is like one position in philosophy of biology to say that this is sort of I guess, an abbreviation or a sort of figurative way of expressing the evolutionary history of the heart. So organisms that had hearts that worked in this way were more successful in surviving and reproducing than other organisms whose hearts did not function in this way. And that's what we mean when we say that the heart has this function. And so this would be a sort of reduction of teleology to evolution, and it would say that when we as biologists, when we describe the function of something, we are just sort of using figurative language that in sort of proper scientific terms would be reduced to evolutionary explanation. And there's debate about whether that sort of reduction is actually possible or appropriate or desirable. Yeah, so I think that sort of goes beyond the limits of what is really described in this book. But the question is whether we can sort of eliminate teleology from our sort of fundamental account of what the world is like, using evolution as sort of the explanation for the appearance of teleology, of what seems to be teleological, and so whether that would sort of allow us to describe the fundamental nature of the world as non-teleological, or whether there's some sort of irreducible teleology to living beings that would make it the case that they are subject to evaluation in terms of whether the heart is properly pumping blood or not, whether the lungs are working properly or not, etc. So this would be some sort of account that would take the living being to be intrinsically teleological and teleology to be irreducible to anything non-teleological. So that's a whole sort of area of debate in philosophy of biology. Yeah, exactly. It's a whole sort of can of worms that requires. You could write a whole book. I mean, people have read books about it, have written books about it. This question. So yeah, beyond what we can really get into too much here, I think.
Sorry, I know we've spent a lot of time on these two paragraphs, but I find this idea. I really like this idea at the end of that first paragraph that when behavior becomes detached from the order of the end itself, says the world, inasmuch as it harbors living beings, ceases to be a material plenum and opens up at the place where behavior appears. This idea that, and maybe this is probably related to the Merleau-Ponty's kind of vitalist position that we talked about in a previous session. But it seems like this idea is that once there's, life making sense of the world in some way, there that structure of behavior, which is what structures the relation to the milieu, is something that's kind of added to the world that wasn't there before. I don't know, kind of an emergence of this sense of activity or the structure of behavior of life. I just think that's a cool idea.
Yeah, I think about this in relation to species extinction a lot of the time, and so that, like, there's, I know in the sort of animal ethics field, there's like a certain amount of debate about whether species extinction is something that is sort of intrinsically bad, or like whether we should be concerned with species extinction as opposed to the death of individual animals or other organisms. Whether there's like something worse or different, bad in a different way about a species becoming extinct as opposed to individual animals dying or failing to reproduce. And the way I think about this is that if we go back to the lion has a certain mode of life, a certain way of existing in the world, and a certain, if we use this language of sort of opening up the place where behavior appears, the world sort of opens up to the lion in a way that it doesn't open up to the antelope or any other animal. And when a certain species disappears, becomes extinct, that sort of way of the world opening up is gone. And so this is sort of a distinct phenomenon. It's different than just an individual lion dying or failing to reproduce, or even sort of the collection of each instance of lions dying. There's a certain sort of aspect of the world, a certain way that the world can present itself that is no longer possible now once lions are extinct. This is like a loss of a certain richness of the world. The way that the world could be has disappeared, and so that's sort of how I think about this. Opening up of the world. It's a kind of possibility that exists only insofar as there are these organisms that have this mode of existence, and only when those organisms are there and engaging in their life in this way is the world open to those organisms in that particular way that their mode of life makes possible. And so Angus has pointed out that this is also related to the way with human cultures, and of course you have to sort of modify exactly what this would mean, because we're dealing with something at the symbolic level in the case of human cultures. But learning a language, so each language has different ways of sort of structuring concepts of which sort of properties of the world are categorized in different ways, how things are structured, and so on. And learning, when that language disappears, then there's a certain way of engaging with the world, a certain way the world appears to people that is gone, that is not possible anymore. I think this is like, if you want to sort of give an explanation of why language preservation and revitalization efforts are important, one element would be just precisely that, when that language disappears, there's a certain aspect of the world that is gone, that is no longer available for the world to sort of present itself in that way. Maybe the last couple of points we can discuss on this passage before we move on. We spent almost an hour on this one reading. I think so. This the fact that so many languages are near extinction. There's I think estimated around 4,000 languages in the world, and I think something like 3/4 of them are thought to be in danger of extinction in the next few generations. So there are many languages that are spoken only by a few hundred or a few thousand people, and you have all kinds of pressures on the speakers of those languages to switch to whatever the dominant language in their area is. So you have people, for example, you have urbanization. All over the world, people are moving to cities, and to be able to navigate the city, to buy groceries and pay rent and so on, you have to use the language of the city as opposed to the language used in your village that you came from or wherever you were before. You have the expansion of education systems over the course of the 20th century, where people are sent to school and learn the official language of the country and so on. All these processes sort of encourage people to adopt the official language or the dominant language of their area and give up their language that is only used by a smaller community, and to not raise their kids using that language. So yeah, it just means that many languages are sort of faced with the prospect of disappearance, and even in some cases where you have, like, say, government programs to support language classes and so on, it's sort of like it's almost a luxury for someone to be able to dedicate time to taking these classes and to want to preserve their culture, whereas all of their sort of everyday motivations would push them instead to switch to the dominant language. So yeah, it's hard to see how many of these languages will be able to survive the next, say, 100 years. And there is something, I think, sad about that, about this way of understanding the world, of depicting the world, of engaging with the world is going to disappear. So I don't have a solution to that problem, but it's just something to sort of recognize and think about, I think. I think we should probably move on to the next bit. We could probably spend a whole session just talking about these couple of paragraphs and everything it brings up. Let's go on to the next bit. So we are on page 126 from There Is. If someone else could read from there.
Yeah, I can read. Okay, hold on. There is then no behavior which certifies a pure consciousness behind it, and the other person is never given to me as the exact equivalent of my self-thinking. In this sense, it is not only to animals that consciousness must be denied. The supposition of a foreign consciousness immediately reduces the world which is given to me to the status of a private spectacle. The world is broken up into a multiplicity of quote-unquote representations of the world, and can no longer be anything but the meaning which they have in common, or the invariant of a system of monads. But in fact, I am aware of perceiving the world as well as behavior which, caught in it, intends numerically one and the same world, which is to say that, in the experience of behavior, I effectively surpass the alternative of the for itself, bourgeois, and the in itself, en soi. Behaviorism, solipsism, and quote-unquote projective theories all accept that behavior is given to me like something spread out in front of me. But to reject consciousness in animals in the sense of pure consciousness, the cogitatio is not to make them autonomous or automatons without interiority. The animal, to an extent which varies according to the integration of its behavior, is certainly another existence. This existence is perceived by everybody. We have described it, and it is a phenomenon which is independent of any notional theory concerning the soul of brutes. Spinoza would not have spent so much time considering a drowning fly if this behavior had not offered to the eye something other than a fragment of extension. The theory of animal machines is a quote-unquote resistance to the phenomenon of behavior. Therefore, this phenomenon must still be conceptualized. The structure of behavior as it presents itself to the perceptual experience is neither thing nor consciousness, and it is this which renders it opaque to the mind. The object of the preceding chapters was not only to establish that behavior is irreducible to its alleged parts. If we had had nothing other in view, instead of this long inductive research, which can never even be finished, since behaviorism can always invent other mechanical models with regard to which the discussion will have to be recommenced, a moment of reflection will have provided us with a certitude in principle. Does not the cogito teach us once and for all that we would have no knowledge of anything if we did not first have a knowledge of our thinking, and that even the escape into the world and the resolution to ignore interiority or to never live things, which is the essential feature of behaviorism, cannot be formulated without being transformed into consciousness and without presupposing existence for itself, bourgeois. Thus, behavior is constituted of relations. That is, it is conceptualized and not in itself, en soi, as is every other object moreover. This is what reflection will have shown us. But by following this short route, we would have missed the essential feature of the phenomenon, the paradox which is constitutive of it. Behavior is not a thing, but neither is it an idea. It is not the envelope of a pure consciousness, and, as the witness of behavior, I am not a pure consciousness. It is precisely this which we wanted to say in stating that behavior is a form. Thus, with the notion of quote-unquote form, we have found the means of avoiding the classical antithesis in the analysis of the quote-unquote central sector of behavior, as well as in that of its visible manifestations. More generally, this notion saves us from the alternative of a philosophy which juxtaposes externally associated terms and of another philosophy which discovers relations which are intrinsic to thought in all phenomena. But precisely for this reason, the notion of form is ambiguous. Up until now, it has been introduced by physical examples and defined by characteristics which made it appropriate for resolving problems of psychology and physiology. Now this notion must be understood in itself, without which the philosophical significance of what precedes would remain equivocal. Okay, that's another pretty difficult paragraph, I guess. I can probably spend another big amount of time in it. I don't remember exactly the Dragonfly reference, but I have heard it somewhere else as well. It's really frustrating. I feel like I have it on the tip of my tongue. If I remember it, I will post it or make a comment, I guess.
Yeah, so here, there's a lot of things going on in these couple paragraphs, but one thing is the Cartesian doctrine of the animal machine. So for Descartes, only human beings have an immortal soul, a rational, a thinking thing, and then all other animals are just machines that are extremely complicated compared to our machines, but at the same time, they're ultimately just pieces of extension that have arrangements of certain kinds that bring about effects depending on what sort of causes are impacting them. The question, in the way that it was sometimes debated at that time and the first couple centuries afterwards was like, is there do animals in fact have a soul? And there was theological debate about this question as well. Is there an immortal soul in a dog or a horse? Again, this sort of presupposes the notion of the animal body and the animal's behavior as being sort of mechanical, and then sort of adds a soul on top of it or not. The question is, whether we need to sort of presuppose or assert that there is a soul in the horse or not. So it just, the soul or the sort of intellectual function of the animal is just sort of added onto this mechanical understanding of the body of the animal. So this sort of debate, I think, is sort of a pattern, or at least the way Merleau-Ponty understands it, is a pattern for the sort of reflex theory or behaviorist theory versus the intellectualist theory. That the intellectualist is sort of doing the same thing of just taking the sort of behaviorist account of animal behavior and adding on this sort of intellectual operation at the end, or sort of on top of the existing sort of behavioral operations of the animal, and then so the debate between the behaviorist and the intellectualist is essentially, do we need to add this intellectual effect or this sort of intellectual function on top of the behavioral sort of associative processes that are involved in the animal? What Merleau-Ponty wants to argue here, or what he's suggesting here, is that this is sort of misconceiving the problem. Like when you present the question in this term, do animals have an immortal soul, or do we need to attribute these sort of intellectual functions to the animal on top of the sort of reflex associations and so on, you're sort of already presupposing this sort of picture of the world as this sort of intrinsically meaningless world made up of spatially extended parts, and then sort of asking whether we have to, how we're supposed to like understand the sort of appearance of meaning in a meaningless world. So how is it the case that we observe animal behavior and see it as directed to a goal, or we communicate with each other and take each other to have expressed meanings and so on? Is that sort of purely illusory and ultimately to be reduced just to sequences of associations, or do we have to add on this sort of non-material or non-associative element on top of it? But what he wants us to do instead is to sort of reject this starting point of the res extensa, the world as composed of spatially juxtaposed bits of matter as being primary, and start from the sort of experience of meaning, of grasping the world as having a structure and having what he calls here a form. So we start from the way that we, for example, understand how to solve a certain type of equation, or how we suddenly we suddenly are able to play a piece that we couldn't play before, etc. These experiences of how something makes sense. We start from this kind of experience, and then we sort of build the grasp of the world as a physically extended sequence or set of spatially extended parts. We grasp that as being built on top of that experience of grasping the form of the world. So it's a sort of reversal of the direction of explanation or direction of understanding. But then in this paragraph on 127, beginning the object of the preceding chapters, so he talks about how it seems like we could have sort of avoided this whole problem if we had sort of drawn the lesson from the cogito argument that Descartes presents, and then sort of understood that our life is always conceptualized, that it's always meaningful. It seems like we could have just avoided behaviorism altogether, that behaviorism would have been a mistake, for example. But then he suggests that this is kind of a shortcut, and we even though behaviorism is incorrect, and these attempts at these sort of mechanical associationist explanations of behavior are incorrect, we still sort of learn something by going through that process, that it wasn't sort of an avoidable detour. It's by means of trying to explain behavior in this mechanical way that we sort of grasp the impossibility or the inappropriateness of grasping behavior in this mechanical way, and that's sort of what exactly is the sort of Hegelian argument. This experience of failure of the mechanical explanation is sort of how we first grasp what it is to be a behavior, which is not something. So it's not a thing, as he said. It's not something mechanical. It's not just a sequence of associations, but it's not an idea either. It's not something sort of projected onto things. It's this sort of intrinsically meaningful way of engaging with the world and of existing that organisms have. So it's not just a sort of interaction of bits of matter with each other in space. It's not an intellectual projection on top of those mechanical interactions. It's something that's sort of between those two things, but different from either of them at the same time. It's not reducible to either of those things or to any combination of those things. But saying that is just sort of characterizing form or behavior in this sort of negative sense. You just say it's not a thing, it's not an idea. And so the problem now is to give a sort of positive characterization of form. What does it mean to describe behavior as having form, or what does it mean to say that behavior has a structure in this sense? And that's what the problem of succeeding chapters of this book is going to be. So how can we grasp what it is for behavior to have a structure or to have a form, not just in the negative terms of what it isn't, but in terms of what it is. Cool. So are there any sort of other comments or questions on that bit? Before, I would suggest we wrap up here rather than starting the next chapter, unless there are other comments or questions.
Just want to add that, as we were talking about before we started, the position of intellectualism that he criticizes as being something that is sort of added on to either added onto the world as res extensa, or added consciousness being added on top of res extensa or on top of instinctual behavior seems like it's still a live issue. The debate in I guess it's fair to say Dreyfus is an analytic philosopher, an analytic phenomenologist, but the debate in analytic philosophy between Dreyfus and McDowell and the place of conceptuality and how it relates to the non-conceptual is pretty close to these concerns. And obviously there are still very many different positions on that debate itself. I know that's a big topic and we don't have to go into it, but I think it's worth noting that it's relevant.
Yeah, thanks. Probably not. Yeah, obviously we could spend a whole session just talking about that debate and what the different positions are. But one bit that we can just mention here. So McDowell has this idea of second nature, of human life as sort of responsive to the space of reasons, as being a second nature that humans are educated into as part of their growing up in a certain cultural environment and so on. But then the question is, like, what is the relationship between first nature and second nature? And then does that just sort of give us, again, this picture of, like, first nature would be this sort of res extensa, this sort of meaningless, mechanical interaction of bits of matter in space, and then second nature would be sort of projected on top of it. If that's the case, then it seems we are sort of doing, again, the kind of thing that turned out to be unsatisfying when we sort of added intellectualism on top of behaviorism. There's reasons to think that is probably not a satisfactory answer, and that we need a different account of what is the relationship between human conceptual capacities and responsiveness to reasons, and then the way that other animals engage with the world, and then the interactions of non-living bits of the world with each other and so on. That all these things need to be understood in some different way that gives a different account of what it means for humans to have this symbolic or conceptual sort of relationship with the world, or form of life and so on. Cool. Okay, so let's end here. So we will pick up from the beginning of chapter 3, these very long chapters. I think there are 4 chapters, if I remember correctly. Let me just take a look. Yeah, there are 4 chapters. So we are roughly halfway through the book at this point. It's great when we stick with one reading, one section for half an hour, 45 minutes, whatever, and just dig into all the different elements that we can tease out of it. And that's, I think, one of the advantages of this type of session compared to a traditional classroom, is that we don't have like a semester where you have to finish this set of readings by this point in the year. We can just decide how long we want to take on any given passage, and go faster or slower as we want, as we read through the book. So yeah, it's that flexibility is very helpful, I think, in engaging with a work in a sort of responsive way, and not just sort of fitting it into an academic semester timeline. All right, so thanks everyone, and hope to see you next week.